The train pulled into Liverpool Street Station on a cold morning in January 1942, and London held its breath. The platform was gray with morning fog, the kind that clung to your lungs and made everything feel heavier than it was. British citizens stood behind barriers wrapped in wool coats that had seen too many winters. Their faces carved with the weariness of a nation that had been bombed, starved, and bled for over 2 years. They had heard the Americans were coming, that help was finally crossing the Atlantic, that the war might finally turn. But what stepped off that train was not what they expected. What stepped off that train would change everything they thought they knew about courage, about humanity, about who deserved to be called a soldier. The doors opened, and black American troops began filing onto British soil. Hundreds of them. Thousands more would follow in the weeks and months ahead. They wore the same uniform as their white counterparts, carried the same rifles, bore the same insignia of the United States Army. But their skin told a different story, one that America had tried to hide, one that segregation had tried to bury beneath. Jim Crow laws and separate water fountains in the back of every bus in every southern town. These men had volunteered to fight for a country that wouldn't let them eat in the same restaurants as white soldiers, that forced them to train in separate camps, that told them they were inferior even as it asked them to die for democracy. And now they stood on foreign ground, uncertain of what reception awaited them, bracing for the familiar sting of rejection they had known all their lives. But something unexpected happened. A British woman, middle-aged, with her hair pinned beneath a faded headscarf, stepped forward. She looked at the young black soldier nearest to her, saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the way his shoulders were squared but his jaw was tight with anticipation of insult. She smiled, not the polite, distant smile of tolerance. A real smile, warm, grateful. She reached out her hand. "Welcome to England, love," she said. "God bless you for coming." The soldier's eyes widened. He had never been called love by a white woman. He had never been touched by one without it being an act of violence or condescension. He shook her hand, feeling something crack open inside his chest. Something that had been closed for so long he had forgotten it could open. Around them, other British citizens began moving forward. An elderly man patted a black corporal on the shoulder. Children waved small Union Jacks and American flags, their faces bright with genuine excitement. Women offered cups of tea from thermoses they had carried to the station. This was not the America these soldiers knew. This was something else entirely. Within days, stories began spreading through London like wildfire. Black American soldiers were walking into pubs and being served at the bar alongside white patrons. They were invited into British homes for Sunday dinner, sitting at tables with families who treated them like honored guests rather than second-class citizens. British women danced with them at social clubs, laughed with them, spoke to them as equals. Children followed them in the streets, not out of fear or mockery, but out of fascination and admiration. The British working class, brutalized by the Blitz, exhausted by rationing, grieving for sons and husbands lost at Dunkirk and in the skies over the Channel, saw in these black soldiers something that resonated deeply. They saw men who had been knocked down by the world and had gotten back up. They saw fighters. They saw dignity in the face of injustice. They saw themselves, but not everyone was pleased. White American officers were horrified. The entire racial structure they had carefully maintained across the Atlantic was crumbling before their eyes. Segregation was not just policy in the American military. It was doctrine, it was dogma, it was the foundational belief that black men were inherently inferior and needed to be controlled, contained, kept in their place. The American command had anticipated resistance from the British, but they had not anticipated acceptance. They had not anticipated friendship. They had not anticipated love. Urgent cables were sent to British authorities. Meetings were held behind closed doors. American commanders made their position clear. The British were undermining military discipline by treating black soldiers as equals. They were creating expectations that could not be maintained once these men returned to America. They were, in essence, spoiling the help. The British response was not what the Americans wanted to hear. A secret memo circulated among British military and civilian leadership, later leaked to the press, revealed the depth of British bewilderment at American racial attitudes. It is pointed out, the memo read, that the British population has no American color prejudice and that it should not be expected to adopt it. British officers were instructed not to enforce American segregation policies on British soil. British pub owners were told they could serve whomever they pleased. British families were free to invite whomever they wished into their homes. The official position was diplomatic but firm. "We are grateful for American help, but we will not adopt American racism." This was revolutionary. This was dangerous. This was exactly what the black soldiers needed to hear. Private James Davis from Alabama had never sat at a white man's table before he came to England. He had never been called sir by a white shopkeeper. He had never held the door for a white woman without her flinching away from him. But in a small village outside London, he found himself sitting in the parlor of a British family named the Hendersons, drinking real tea from china cups, eating biscuits that Mrs. Henderson had saved from her rations specifically for this occasion. Mr. Henderson asked him about his life in America, and when James hesitated, unsure how much truth to tell, the old man leaned forward and said gently, "We've heard things, son. We know it's not been easy for your people. But you're here now, and you're welcome here. You're more than welcome." James felt tears prick at his eyes. He was 22 years old and had never been welcomed anywhere outside his own community. He wrote to his mother that night, "Mama, you wouldn't believe it. They treat us like human beings here. They treat us like men." The transformation was visible in the posture of these soldiers, in the way they began to walk through British streets. Back home, they'd learned to make themselves smaller to avoid eye contact with white people, to step off sidewalks when white pedestrians approached, to speak softly and deferentially, to apologize for existing. These were survival strategies learned young, passed down from fathers to sons, from mothers to daughters. The unwritten rules of staying alive under Jim Crow. But in Britain, something fundamental shifted. A black corporal named Thomas Wright from Louisiana noticed it first in himself after 2 weeks in London. He was walking down a street in uniform when a white British man approached from the opposite direction. Thomas's instinct was to step aside, to defer, to make space. But the British man smiled at him and said, "Good afternoon, soldier," and moved to the side himself, giving Thomas the right of way. Thomas kept walking, but his heart was pounding. It was such a small thing, such a tiny gesture. But it contained within it a revolution. It said, "You matter." It said, "You have the same rights to this sidewalk, to this space, to this world as anyone else." Thomas wrote to his sister that week, "I can't explain it exactly, but something in me is standing up straighter. Something in me that was bent is straightening out." The social integration deepened as more troops arrived, and as the British people came to know these soldiers not as a category, but as individuals. In the town of Bristol, a black medic named Samuel Peterson saved the life of a British child who had been hit by a military truck. Samuel worked for 20 minutes performing CPR, refusing to give up even when others thought it was hopeless, and the child survived. The child's mother, a widow whose husband had died at sea, invited Samuel to her home every week for the rest of his deployment. She introduced him to her extended family, to her neighbors, to her church community. Samuel found himself embraced by an entire British network that saw him as a hero, as a lifesaver, as a man of extraordinary skill and compassion. When his deployment ended and he prepared to return to America, the widow gave him a photograph of her daughter and a letter that he would keep for the rest of his life. "You gave me back my reason for living," she wrote. "You are a blessing from God, and I will never forget you. Please know that somewhere in England, you have a family that loves you and will always consider you one of our own." These relationships were not anomalies. They were happening across Britain wherever black troops were stationed. In Scotland, in Wales, in the English countryside, in industrial cities and rural villages, black soldiers were experiencing a level of acceptance that shattered their understanding of how the world worked. They were being seen. They were being valued. They were being loved. And it was breaking something open inside them. Something that segregation had tried to seal shut. The belief that they deserved this treatment. That it was not a gift or an exception, but a basic human right that had been denied them by an unjust system. But the American military establishment was not about to let this continue without a fight. In the summer of 1942, the U.S. command issued what became known internally as the Integration Problem Directive. American military police units were expanded and given explicit orders to maintain segregation even on British soil. White American officers began giving lectures to British civilians, attempting to explain American racial attitudes and to convince the British that fraternization with black troops was dangerous and inappropriate. These lectures were extraordinary in their condescension and their naked racism. British audiences were told that black soldiers were mentally inferior, that they were prone to violence, that they carried diseases, that white women who associated with them were degrading themselves and risking assault. The lectures were based on pseudoscientific theories that had been debunked decades earlier, but that remained gospel in the American South and in the American military. The British reaction ranged from polite bewilderment to open hostility. In one famous incident in the town of Launceston, an American colonel gave a lecture to local British authorities about the necessity of maintaining racial separation. He explained that black soldiers needed to be kept away from white women for everyone's safety. He cited statistics that were fabricated, theories that were absurd, and warnings that were insulting. When he finished, a British woman in the audience, a schoolteacher named Margaret Harris, stood up. "Colonel," she said, her voice steady and cold, "we have had black soldiers billeted in this town for 3 months. In that time, they have been perfect gentlemen. They have helped our elderly residents with chores. They have played football with our children. They have attended our churches and been model guests. We have had precisely 0 problems with them. The only problems that we have had are with white American soldiers who come into our pubs drunk and looking for fights. So with all due respect, sir, we will decide for ourselves who is welcome in our community. And your Negro soldiers are very welcome indeed." The room erupted in applause. The colonel left in humiliation. The story spread across Britain and became a rallying point for British resistance to American racial policies. The resistance took many forms. British railway workers sometimes deliberately gave black troops better accommodations than white troops, placing them in first-class carriages while white soldiers rode in standard ones. British pub owners put up signs saying this establishment serves all Allied servicemen regardless of race. British families invited black soldiers to Christmas celebrations and treated them as honored guests while pointedly not inviting white American soldiers who had been rude or condescending. British churches opened their doors to black troops and gave them prominent places in services, sometimes to the fury of white American chaplains who expected segregated worship. The message was clear: Britain would not be America's accomplice in racial oppression. This created real tension within the Allied command structure. British officers were increasingly uncomfortable taking orders from American officers they viewed as bigots. British soldiers were forming friendships with black American troops and were disgusted by the way they saw white American soldiers treating their black comrades. The racial dynamic of the American military was poisoned to unit cohesion in a combined force, and British commanders began filing complaints. General Dwight Eisenhower, to his credit, recognized the problem and tried to moderate the worst excesses of segregation. But he was caught between military necessity and political reality. The American South had tremendous political power, and Southern senators had made it clear that integration of the military was unacceptable. Eisenhower did what he could, which was not enough, but was more than many other American commanders would have done. Meanwhile, the black soldiers themselves were being radicalized by their British experience. They began writing letters home that were unlike anything they had written before. They wrote about being treated with dignity. They wrote about eating in restaurants where they were welcomed. They wrote about dating women who saw them as men, not as a racial category. They wrote about children who admired them. They wrote about a society that, while imperfect, did not have codified racial apartheid as its foundation. These letters were read aloud in black churches across America. They were passed from hand to hand in black communities. They were discussed in barbershops and beauty salons and family dinners. They created a cognitive dissonance that could not be resolved. If black soldiers could be treated as equals in Britain, why not in America? If British people could see past race, why couldn't white Americans? The excuses that have been given for generations, the claims that segregation was natural and inevitable and necessary, began to crumble in the face of evidence that there was another way. The authorities noticed. The FBI began monitoring letters from black soldiers in Britain, looking for signs of what they called racial agitation. Military censors were instructed to black out passages that described positive treatment by British civilians. Black newspapers that published soldiers' accounts of life in Britain were investigated for potential sedition. The establishment understood that these stories were dangerous, that they threatened the entire structure of American racial hierarchy. If black soldiers came home believing they deserved equality, believing they had experienced it and that it was possible, they would not quietly return to subordination. They would demand change. And that demand would be backed by the moral authority of men who had risked their lives for their country. In the town of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, the tension exploded into violence. It was June 1943, and the 1511th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, a black unit, was stationed there. The soldiers had formed warm relationships with the local population. They drank in the local pubs, attended local dances, dated local women. The white American military police hated this. They saw it as a breakdown of the natural order. On the night of June 24th, white MPs attempted to arrest a black soldier at a pub for supposedly being drunk and disorderly. The soldier was neither drunk nor disorderly. The MPs were simply asserting their authority. The British pub owner, a man named Henry Stringfellow, refused to allow the arrest. He told the MPs that the soldier had done nothing wrong and was welcome in his establishment. Other British patrons formed a barrier around the soldier. The MPs called for reinforcements. What happened next was a race riot that lasted for hours. Black soldiers from the regiment, hearing that their comrade was being arrested, converged on the town center. They were armed. They were angry. They were done being passive. White MPs fired shots. The black soldiers fired back. One black soldier, Private William Crossland, was killed. Several others were wounded. But the black soldiers held their ground. They refused to disperse. They refused to accept the authority of the white MPs, and most importantly, the British population stood with them. British civilians testified that the white MPs had started the confrontation. British police refused to arrest the black soldiers. British magistrates later ruled that the black soldiers had acted in self-defense. The town of Bamber Bridge put up signs in pub windows reading "Black Troops Only," a deliberate reversal of the whites-only signs that black soldiers knew from home. It was an act of solidarity that stunned the American military command and gave courage to black troops across Britain. Private Eugene Walker from Texas was part of the unit at Bamber Bridge. He had grown up being taught that fighting back against white authority meant death, that the only survival strategy was submission and silence. But on that night in Bamber Bridge, he picked up his rifle and stood with his brothers, and he felt something he had never felt before: power. Not over others, but over his own life. The power to say no, the power to defend himself, the power to demand respect. He wrote in a letter to his brother, "I have crossed a line tonight that I can never uncross. I have stood up to white men who tried to treat me like an animal, and I have survived. British people stood with us. British people chose our side. I don't know what will happen when I go home, but I know I will never bow my head again. I have tasted freedom, and I will fight for it the rest of my life." As the war progressed toward D-Day, black troops participated in every aspect of the preparation. They built the artificial harbors that would be towed across the channel. They loaded the ships with supplies. They trained for the invasion. And despite official policy that relegated them to support roles, many black soldiers ended up in combat. When units took casualties and needed replacements, commanders in the field often did not care about the color of the reinforcements. They needed soldiers who could fight, and black troops proved they could fight as well as anyone. The 761st Tank Battalion, a black unit, would later distinguish itself in the European campaign with extraordinary valor. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only black unit to land on D-Day, came ashore under fire and performed their mission flawlessly. These men were proving every day that the racist assumptions underlying segregation were lies, that courage and competence had nothing to do with skin color, that they were the equals of any soldiers in any army in the world. But it was what happened after combat that revealed the depth of the change that had occurred in these men. Black soldiers who had fought in Europe returned to Britain on leave and were shocked by the contrast. On the battlefield, they were valued for their contribution. In liberated France, they were celebrated as liberators. But when they returned to American-controlled areas in Britain, segregation was enforced again. They were sent to separate facilities, given inferior accommodations, treated as second-class soldiers once more. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Sergeant David Williams from North Carolina had helped liberate a French village, had been kissed and hugged and toasted by grateful French civilians who saw him as a hero. 2 days later, he was back in Britain and was refused service at an American military canteen because he was black. He sat outside that canteen and wept, not out of sadness, but out of rage. "I have saved lives," he said to a British woman who asked him what was wrong. "I have fought Nazis. I have freed people from concentration camps. And my own country treats me like dirt. How is that possible? How's that, right?" The woman had no answer. No one had an answer that made any sense. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, and the celebrations were bittersweet for black troops. They had contributed to the defeat of fascism, had helped destroy a regime built on racial superiority and racial hatred. But they knew they were returning to a country that had its own version of racial hierarchy, its own system of oppression. The irony was not lost on them. They had fought for freedom abroad and would have to fight for it again at home, but they were different now. They had seen what was possible. They had experienced being treated as full human beings. They had friendships with British families that had shown them that racial prejudice was not universal or inevitable. They had the moral authority of veterans, of men who had served and sacrificed. And they had each other, a network of black soldiers who had shared this transformative experience and who would not be silent about it. The journey home was long and complicated. Some black soldiers stayed in Britain, marrying British women and building lives in a country that had accepted them. Thousands of others returned to America, many of them to the South, where Jim Crow was still the law of the land. They returned to separate water fountains and separate schools and separate everything. They returned to being called boy by white men half their age. They returned to a society that wanted them to forget what they had learned, to forget what they had experienced, to go back to the way things had always been. But they could not forget. They would not forget. The British connection remained strong in the decades after the war. British war brides who had married black American soldiers and moved to the United States became some of the most outspoken critics of American segregation. These women had grown up in a society with its own problems, its own class divisions, its own forms of prejudice, but they had not grown up with legal racial apartheid. When they arrived in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, they were genuinely shocked. They had not believed it could be as bad as their husbands had described. They wrote letters back to Britain describing the conditions, and those letters were published in British newspapers, creating outrage and sympathy. British women's organizations raised money to help these war brides and their families. British civil rights groups formed in solidarity with the American civil rights movement. The connection that had been forged during the war between black Americans and the British people continued to shape both societies for generations. In the American South, returning black veterans became leaders of the civil rights movement. They had organizational skills from the military. They had courage forged in combat. They had a vision of what equality looked like because they had lived it, however briefly, in Britain. They refused to sit at the back of the bus. They refused to accept inferior schools for their children. They refused to be denied the right to vote. They organized voter registration drives. They filed lawsuits. They protested. They marched. And when white supremacists tried to intimidate them, tried to use violence to force them back into submission, they fought back. These were men who had faced Nazi artillery and survived. They were not going to be frightened by the Ku Klux Klan. Organizations like the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference were filled with black veterans who brought military discipline and strategic thinking to the freedom struggle. The Montgomery bus boycott, the Greensboro sit-ins, the freedom rides, the March on Washington, all of these pivotal moments in the civil rights movement involved black veterans who had returned from World War II, changed men who had experienced freedom and would settle for nothing less. Sergeant Major John Patterson from Mississippi returned from the war with a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. He had been wounded at the Battle of the Bulge and had recuperated in a British hospital where the nurses treated him with the same care they gave any patient. When he got home, he tried to register to vote and was turned away because he failed a literacy test that was designed to be impossible for black people to pass. He looked at the white registrar, a man who had never left the county, who had never risked anything, who was denying him a basic right despite his service and sacrifice. John did not argue. He did not plead. He walked out of that courthouse and within a week had organized a group of black veterans who began a systematic campaign to register black voters. It took years. It was dangerous. Several members of his group were beaten. One was killed. But they persisted, and by the early 1960s, they had helped register thousands of black voters in Mississippi, fundamentally changing the political landscape. When John was asked years later why he had taken such risks, he said simply, "I learned in England that I was a man. I learned that I deserved the same rights as any other man." Once you learn that, you can't unlearn it. You can't go back to accepting less. The British people themselves never forgot the black American soldiers. Even now, decades after the war, there are communities in Britain that maintain memorials to the black troops who were stationed there. There are historical societies that preserve their letters and photographs. There are families that still treasure the friendships their grandparents formed with black soldiers. In the town of Bamber Bridge, there is a permanent exhibition about the race riot and the solidarity shown by the British population. The story has been passed down through generations as a point of local pride, a moment when ordinary people stood on the right side of history. British schoolchildren learn about this period, about the complicated racial dynamics of the Allied forces, about the courage of black soldiers and the courage of British civilians who stood with them against injustice. What happened in Britain between 1942 and 1945 was a preview of what America could become, a glimpse of a world where people were judged by their character and their actions rather than by the color of their skin. It was not perfect. Britain had its own racial issues, its own colonial atrocities, its own prejudices. But in that particular moment, with those particular soldiers, something beautiful happened. A connection was made. A truth was demonstrated. And that truth could not be undone. The black soldiers who experienced equality in Britain carried that experience with them for the rest of their lives. They told their children about it. They told their grandchildren about it. They told their communities about it. And in telling it, they kept alive the knowledge that the way things were was not the way things had to be. That change was possible, that justice was achievable, that freedom was not just a word but a lived reality that could be experienced by everyone. The men who stepped off that train at Liverpool Street Station in January 1942 were not supposed to change the world. They were supposed to be invisible, subordinate, grateful for the chance to serve a country that despised them. But they became something more. They became witnesses to the possibility of change. They became living proof that racism was not natural or inevitable, but a choice that societies made and could therefore unmake. They became heroes, not just because they fought in a war, but because they carried themselves with dignity in the face of humiliation, because they opened their hearts to kindness when they had every reason to be bitter, because they refused to let hatred destroy their humanity. Britain saw that in them. Britain honored that in them. And in doing so, Britain gave them a gift that would echo through generations, the gift of being seen, of being valued, of being loved for who they were. That gift transformed individuals. It strengthened a movement. It changed history. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video because it helps us continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history to light. Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us if you'd heard about this incredible moment before, or if you have family members who experienced this period. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of courage, dignity, and the unbreakable human spirit that changed the course of history. These are the stories they didn't teach us in school, the moments that shaped our world quietly and powerfully, the heroes who never got their parades but who deserved them more than anyone. We remember them, we honor them, and we make sure their truth is never forgotten again.